Hey everybody, welcome to Master the NEC, where we talk about the National Electrical Code. This episode is Electrical Code Questions. We're going to talk about some questions that were submitted or that I found online that needed some answers, so we took the opportunity to do a little video here and explain those questions. Now, whether or not you're an apprentice or you're a new to the electrical industry or new to the trade or you're a seasoned veteran, remember you can always send your electrical code questions to us here at Electrical Code Academy Incorporated by going to info@electricalcodeacademy.com or info@masterthenec.com, and I'm more than happy to try to answer those questions for you, whether it be just on an email. I get hundreds of emails a week asking me code questions from jurisdictions, AHJs, from engineers all over the country every week, and I love answering those questions. But if you have a question, feel free to contact and reach out to us so that we can answer that question for you. Okay? So, today's episode, we have two questions that we're going to answer. Now, two installation-specific type of questions that utilize the NEC. So let's jump into those right away. The first question we have is, I'm doing a custom home with a meter pedestal at a street. I am running 4-aught aluminum to a 200 amp disconnect on the house. The trench will run under a potential parking area or driveway. Looking at 300.5, I see the required burial depth is 24 inches deep under the drive or parking area, and only 18 inches when it's not under a drive or parking area. In conduit or not, this seems really shallow for a service feed. Am I missing something? Because I plan to go at least 36 inches deep in Schedule 80 PVC. Okay, we'll try to answer this one pretty quick for you. First of all, whether you want to do it 36 inches, 24 inches is totally up to you, because both of those depths are deeper than you need to be in your example here, and I'll explain that in more detail. Now, the choice of running Schedule 80, again, is up to you. It is buried in the ground. You can run Schedule 40, Schedule 80. You can have direct burial conductors. Whatever your choice, whatever your flavor, it's going to affect the depth of cover. But in this case, there's no real need to run Schedule 80. You could run Schedule 40 if the PVC is what you want to run. You want to put it in a raceway, then that's perfectly your option to do so. Obviously, the depth of cover gets less when you run it other types of methods, but in this case, really it doesn't going to make any difference on whether or not it's Schedule 40, Schedule 80, or what have you when it comes to the depth, and you'll see that in more detail when we look at it here in a second. 36 inches, again, you can always go above and beyond the code. Now, sometimes it gets in trouble because when grounding and bonding comes in, sometimes people tend to want to do too much, and it becomes, you go from an unsafe condition to a safe condition to an unsafe condition again because they just do too much. And they go too far thinking more is better, and sometimes it's not. But in this case, 36 inches is more than enough. In fact, if you look at the National Electrical Safety Code and the utility, they'll have probably some cover requirements that can be anywhere from 30 inches to 36 inches of cover. And sometimes they'll exactly mirror whatever's in the National Electrical Code, and you just follow that. But each power utility has their own blue book or whatever book they have that gives them the requirements for depth of cover when it's under their exclusive control, and you might be doing it for them as a mutual agreement or something like that. But other than that, if it falls under the National Electrical Code, which I'm going to assume we're in that aspect here because of some of the words in your question, and we'll look at that in a little more depth here, then you are going to go to 300.5, and that's where you're going to get your answer. Now, it seems to me you've gone there because you've referenced it, and you're dealing with a residential application because you say it's a custom home. I'm also assuming that you've determined that the service point is at that street meter pedestal, where the utility brings it there and says, okay, now it's your responsibility from here over to the actual dwelling unit. So that is where the service point will be. That's the demarcation line between where the utility connects and the premise wiring begins. Okay, so we're assuming that you've established that because you are making reference to 300.5, and because of the size of the conductors you're chosen, utility tends to, if it was a service ladder, for example, they choose it based on data and certain things like that, or they even tell you the size to be because it's outside of the scope of the NEC, kind of like service drop conductors. They kind of have some history. They run that, so unless you're running it, then you have to follow the National Electrical Code if it's on the load side, if you will, of that service point. Okay, where it changes from utility to actually premise wiring. All right, so let's kind of dig into the question. So you have a disconnect at the house. and you have the meter pedestal. Again, remembering that a meter is not service equipment. Okay, so it's simply passing through it. So what you've got is there is no service lateral, because that service lateral is utility based, okay, up to the service point. Well, we've established the service point. In this case, it's your meter pedestal. Now what you have is underground service conductors. They go over and up into your disconnect. And at that point, 300.5 is going to apply, and we'll look at that. Now, you say that you see 24 inches of cover when it's under a driveway or parking area. That is absolutely correct when it's a commercial driveway, a street, parking area like that. However, from this question, you have a residential driveway or a residential parking area. And if that's the case, the depth of cover can be reduced down to 18 inches. But let's look at 300.5 so we can get some even more detail on this type of question you're asking. All right, so here is the NEC. And we're at 300.5, and this is your minimum cover requirements for 0 to 1,000 volts, which is more than sure that's what you're dealing with, because it's a residential application. And it's the minimum cover. The first thing before we even look at all these columns, I like to go down and point out something. That note 1, which is enforceable, because notes are enforceable when they're applicable to the actual table. If it had a said informational note, it would just be good information, but notes are applicable here. So it says, this cover here that we're talking about, 18 inches, 24 inches, whatever, it says the cover is defined by the shortest distance in inches measured between a point on the top surface of any direct burial conductor, cable, conduit, or other raceway, in our case your PVC Schedule 80, and the top surface of finished grade, concrete, or similar type of covering. All right, so that is from the top of your raceway to the actual finished grade or the top surface of wherever you're running, wherever you're digging this trench. Okay, so if, for example, if I have a trade size 2 raceway and it says the depth of cover was 18 inches and I have a 2 trade size, then I want to make sure that I dig it deep enough so that I have an adequate amount of coverage. So if it's 2 inches and I go down, it's 18 inches is my cover requirement, and I go down 2 more inches so that raceway can sit down here, then from the top of that raceway up to the top surface is going to be the depth of cover. Okay, that's real important, because some people dig a trench that they have a trade size 2 raceway, and then they dig it 18 inches. They put that raceway in it. The inspector comes along with the ruler and measures it from the top of that raceway, and then you only have 16 inches of cover. All right, then you have a problem, because the code says I have to have 18 inches of cover. Okay, so you got to be careful of that. Have some foresight into doing that when you dig that trench. Now, in your case, a 36-inch deep trench, not going to be an issue. But I don't know why you'd want to dig it that deep. But again, you can go above and beyond the code if you wish. And you want to put it 36 inches, you go for it. If you want it to be in Schedule 80 PVC, you go for it. Does it require it to be in those? No. Okay. So let's go back to look at the code a little more. All right. So we've established that. Now, here's where I think we're walking into it here. You're in column 3 because you're dealing with the non-metallic raceway listed for direct burial. That's that PVC is. All right, and you're coming down here and you're seeing this right here under streets, highways, roads, driveways, and parking lots. But what you're failing, and it is 24 inches, you are absolutely correct. However, what you're failing to see is that you said this was a custom home, so we're assuming, and based on the size of the service, tells me that this is a 1 or 2 family dwelling. So the driveways or outdoor parking areas that are associated with that dwelling unit purpose only has to have a depth of cover of 18 inches. Okay, so to kind of summarize your question here at the end, can it be 36? Sure. Depth, can I put it in Schedule 80 PVC? Sure, no problem. You're going above and beyond what's required. Could it be in Schedule 40? Most certainly could be in that. Since we're dealing with a PVC or a non-metallic raceway, your 2 choices generally is, in keeping it basic, we're dealing with Schedule 40 or Schedule 80. Okay, just keeping it the basic 2 that you're probably going to run most of the time. 40 or 80 is fine. Now, the question some people have is when it starts to transition above. If wherever it transitions above is subject to physical damage, then you might want to stick with the 80 as it transitions. But the part in the ground could be Schedule 40. That's totally up to you if you want to run 40 or Schedule 80. Totally up to you. Now, Personally, I don't think that I'd run it 36 inches deep. One, that puts a lot of toll on your digging equipment. It is a lot more to deal with, and it's not required because we've established that the conductors from that meter pedestal to your disconnect outside are underground service conductors, and they fully are governed under the National Electrical Code. We can find the definition of those in Article 100 of the National Electrical Code, which clearly is going to define the point between the service point and the meter or disconnect or other enclosure. In your case, is a disconnect enclosure. All constitute, those are underground service conductors. Okay, so 300.5 is going to apply. And as we saw, you're in column 3 of 300.5, and you're not in a commercial driveway or street or what have you. You're in a residential 1 and 2 family application, then you can have that reduction to 18. Just remember that that's 18 inches of cover from the top of your raceway. Okay, keep that in mind. So it may be a little deeper than 18 inches, 20 inches if you're using a trade size 2 for that application. That way you've got enough depth of cover. All right, so that's that question. Hopefully that answered that for you. The next question that we have is, how do I size my grounding electrode conductor when I have a 400 amp service with parallel 3/0 copper conductors? Okay, now a couple things I want to throw out to people that, now I'm going to answer this question, but some of the things that I want to throw out to people that they've got to think about here, because we have some options. First of all, what type of grounding electrode conductor are we dealing with? Is it a ground rod, a ground plate, a pipe electrode? Is it a concrete encased electrode? Is it a ground ring? Is it a water pipe ground? Okay, all of those things have to be taken into account. Okay, so in our example here, if it's not a ground rod, which would only require a 6 gauge under 250.66a, okay, if it is not a concrete encased electrode, which would only require a 4 gauge AWG copper for that application if it was a concrete encased electrode under 250.66b. And we're going to assume it's not a ground ring because you didn't make reference to that. And ground rings are 2 AWG, and they encircle the actual dwelling. And that application, it doesn't have to be larger than that, so it would be 2 gauge. And that is not referenced inside of your question. So for our argument's sake here, and we're not going to talk about supplemental electrodes because we're going to talk about this as being a water pipe ground. Okay, we're not going to talk about the requirement to supplement it with one of the other electrodes in the list. We're just purely going to say, okay, it's a water pipe ground, so now I have to use table 250.66 rather than the allowances in 250.66 A, B, and C. Okay, so we're going to assume it's a water pipe ground at this point. Okay, we don't know otherwise, and it probably could be something else. The real quick reason I say that is because the person that asked this question, more often than not, you're dealing with a ground rod. And if it was a ground rod, it doesn't have to be larger than a 6 gauge copper. Okay, so that would be a simple answer. Okay, but we're going to assume the harder answer, and we're going to assume that it is a water pipe ground. And again, not going to talk about the supplementing of it. We're just going to talk about the connection to the water pipe ground. Okay, makes it simple. All right, first things first, we have to look at 250.66 because we are sizing a grounding electrode conductor. So what we want to do is going over, and I'll get over to the code book and start looking it up here. All right, so some people will say, Paul, why don't you use the search feature? And I probably should do that, but let's go on and do here, there, and sometimes it's just easier for me because I know what I'm looking for to just do that. See, I already went too far. Oops. I guess it's because I can't see it. All right, 250.66. All right, so here's what we've got. Now let me get rid of this here. All right, 250.66 says, and that's for the alternating current grounding electrode conductor, as you see here. It says that the size of the grounding electrode conductor at the service, that's what we're dealing with, at each building or structure where supplied by a feeder or branch circuit, or at a separately derived system of a grounded or ungrounded AC system, shall not be less than given in table 250.66. Okay, so it can't be less than what's in the table 250.66. except as permitted in 250.66 A through C. And that's where we're talking about if it was a ground rod pipe or plate electrode, or if it was a concrete encased electrode, or if it was connection to a ground ring. Okay. In those cases, you can see that, like I said, concrete encased doesn't have to be any larger than a 4 copper. You see no provision here for an aluminum connection because typically that connection is made at a location that is less than 18 inches from the earth, so that would prohibit it from being aluminum. But in this case right here, ground rods, it could be 6 AWG copper wire, and here it says it could be 4 AWG aluminum wire, which is kind of weird considering that ground rod has to be driven fully in the earth as well. But again, you have to understand that aluminum conductors couldn't be installed within 18 inches of the earth anyway when it comes to that connection for the grounding electrode conductor. So that's another episode at another time. We're going to stick with copper unless described otherwise. So only have to be 6 AWG copper. Doesn't have to be larger than that. Not required to be, but it could be, but it's not required to be. Or 4 AWG copper for a concrete encased electrode. Okay, so first let's go back to me real quick. So the user didn't say what type of electrodes. That would have been helpful. Always helpful in a question if the user asks and puts in there, I'm running, what size grounding electrode conductor do I need to a ground rod, or to a ground ring, or to a plate electrode, or to a pipe electrode, or to a water pipe ground. All of those aspects are beneficial to be able to supply the person that's answering the question. So when you don't, we're going to give you the gamut. Now, when I'm replying to questions like this, I remind them of those different types of electrodes that have a specific application, 6, 4, what have you. But if the question, for example, here is open-ended, I'm going to still give them that information because they might be using one of those electrodes and they get their answer right away. But in this case, we're going to assume a water pipe ground. We're not going to worry about the supplemental. We're talking about the water pipe connection. And in this case right here, we need to use table 250.66. So let's go to table 250.66 for this application. All right, so now, here's the table right here. And here's what this table says. Now, this is for grounding electrode conductors. Size of the largest ungrounded service entrance conductor or equivalent area of parallel conductors. Okay. In this case, we said we're running 2 parallel 3/0. Okay. Now, one thing I want to point out is note, again, this is not an informational note, this is actual note, so it is applicable to this actual section. And it says, if multiple sets of service entrance conductors connected directly to a service drop, set of overhead service conductors, or set of underground service conductors, or service lateral, the equivalent size of the largest service entrance conductor shall be determined by the largest sum. Now, the sum is adding together of the areas of the corresponding conductors of each set. Okay, so now we know that we're dealing with 3/0. So we need to know the area. So when we're learning the area, we need to know what the circular mills are of this 3/0 conductor. So that's going to take us to Chapter 9, Table 8 for conductor properties. Okay, so let's go do that now. So we're getting to the code here. We're going to expand it open here. And we're going to go close this. And we're going to go down here to Chapter 9. And then I'm going to skip down to Table 8. And we're too far. Okay, there we go. Now let me close this up. Now, we're dealing with area, because that's what the code asked. Okay, so we're going down to 3/0 right here. And 3/0 has an area of 100, and it won't let me highlight it by itself, so oh, there it goes. Has 167,800 circular mills. Okay, now we've got 2 of them here. Okay, so we have to deal with that application. So let's come back to me. Okay, so we have 167,800 times 2. We have to do that math first. Then, and only then, can we begin to even look at using table 250.166. 250.66. God, I started thinking about DC, 250.166. I just did an episode on photovoltaic and DC electrodes, and Okay, so many classes, so many courses. This was a private course that I did for a private company. So I had to do that video. It wasn't for public, it was for them. So I do a lot of those little private videos to explain things for these corporations and different things. So anyway, sorry about that. So let's go back. So now let's go back to our PowerPoint. And then we're in our PowerPoint. Here's what we've got. We've got a 3/0 copper, 167,800 circular mils. We got that from Chapter 9, Table 8. We do that times 2 because it's a parallel set. So we've got 335,600 circular mils. Now, they don't make a conductor that's 335,600 circular mils. So the closest equivalent, without going backwards, because we can't go backwards, we go forward. The closest one that we can get to is 350,000 circular mils. Okay? So a 350 kc mil is the actual conductor combined sum that we're now going to go back to table 250.66 and determine what size grounding electroconductor we need. So let's do that. And you see the answer here, but we're going to go back and do that. So let me go back here to the code. And we've done that. And of course, you see it was 335,000 plus, and there's nothing in here. So 350,000 is the next size that's going to accommodate that requirement. Okay, for that. Now, let's go back to that area of the code. So I'm going to click in here and go back to 250.66. All right. And let's get to it. We know it's on the left. Here. Okay. Close this. All right. So we're dealing with 350. So over 3/0 through 350. Some people get confused and start jumping down here when they see over 350. We weren't. We chose the 350s through 350. So the size of the grounding electroconductor in this case would be a 2. All right. So it really is, at the end of the day, it really is that simple. Now, you have to understand the electrode. We've covered that. You need to know whether or not you're dealing with a ground rod, a plate, pipe. Then you're going to go to 250.66a. Doesn't have to be larger than that. Routinely, engineers will oversize it for whatever reasons, and that's their reasons, and they have every right to do it. And if they put it on a drawing, the easiest thing for you to do is, if the drawings are approved by the local jurisdiction, do what it says on the drawings. If you were to value engineer it out, you might be able to talk to that engineer and say, look, man, it's a ground rod. Lightning on that ground rod can only handle what it can handle. It only needs to be a 6. It doesn't have to be larger than that. You know, I'd like to reduce it down to a 6 AWG copper, and you might be receptive of that, and you might not. Okay. Incidentally, when I should also point out that if you go back to the code, and let's do that real quick because I want to show you, is that in no case, as it said earlier, does it have to be larger than a 3/0. Okay. Or 250 kc mil of aluminum or copper clad aluminum. Okay, so it doesn't have to be larger than a 3/0. In our case, it happened to be a 2, but it doesn't have to be larger than a 3/0. So I guess I want to also point that out. We are not talking about bonding jumpers. Okay, that's in 250.102C1. Whereas if you get over a certain size, and you're getting to 12.5%, because it has a different role. Okay. Ground rods and things like that and electrodes are very limited, whereas you don't want that limitation when it comes to bonding jumpers and things like that, to be able to handle that fault current application during your installation. So two different aspects here, and that's probably why they stopped using table 250.66, which is for grounding electroconductors, and they put all the bonding jumpers, main bonding jumper, all that kind of sizing and all that, all the way up in 250.102C1 because of clarity there and being able to explain it. So that was the real rule there. So hopefully these two questions have been good for you to help answer your questions. I've kind of kept it under 30 minutes. Again, if you have any additional questions on sizing or conductors or overcurrent devices or whatever you have, box fill, it doesn't matter. Send us an email at info@masterthenec.com or send us an email at info@electrocodeacademy.com. Visit our website. Visit our message board, visit our Facebook page, visit our Twitter account, subscribe to our Twitter, subscribe to our Facebook. I constantly have videos coming out. If you're a private corporation and you want something clarified and you need a video to use for your educational purposes for your staff, let me know. We're more than happy to produce something like that for you. But these videos like today are for you, the electrician, a next generation of electrician who need to learn all these little nuances of the code. Hopefully I've been able to explain it to you. Again, thanks for spending time with me today. God bless, and until next time, stay safe.